I'll kick things off. Tim, you're very welcome. We're going to keep on time now out of respect for the people who are here on time, so we'll just kick it off. You're all very welcome, Tim. I know you, I've heard your name around the office quite a bit. I think we've been in email contact, so it's good to meet you. So many other people are coming in after this. This is a regular Zoom call, so if you don't want to be heard or whatever, make sure you're muted, or if you want to chip in, just unmute and have a chat. My name is James Kennedy. I'm the CEO at Procurement Express. We have sponsored this talk with Kala Dikibo of Telso, and the aim really is to share best practices when it comes to procurement. Kala is someone who really brings a lot of energy and enthusiasm to all aspects of procurement, and that's why we've invited him along here today. He's going to talk to us for, I think, 30 minutes or so, specifically about specifications and so on. If you're a Procurement Express customer, part of the intention here is if you have a specific issue you want to bring up with Kala, you'd be very welcome to schedule time with him, and we can sponsor that as well. But in the meantime, if you have any other questions or anything, you can just one or two bits of housekeeping, which is if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat at the bottom, or there's a little reactions button, and you can raise your hand. Also, you can click on that to raise your hand. And I think Kala would like a bit of interactivity here, so it's not going to be super formal. If you have any questions, please do that, or just chip in. And that's it. And I'll be back at the end, and we'll wrap it up then. So with that, I'll hand over to Kala Dikibo of Telso.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, James. Nice to meet you all. This, as James has said, is the first of 6 scheduled weekly webinars. And the whole aim of it is to provide more context to procurement practice, best practice, global best practice. Those of you who are existing clients already have the benefits of the software, but this is an added string to your bow, per se, in terms of giving you that additional information that can help drive profitability within your organization, both from a cost standpoint as well as a value-added standpoint as well. As James also said, I'm here to answer any questions that you may have around procurement, particularly around, as I said, best practice, but also processes internally, and how, from an organizational structural point of view and a philosophical point of view as well. Because a lot of times there's a need for companies to change the way they approach procurement from being reactionary to being more proactive and strategic and collaborative. And I'm also here, obviously, to help about that. And I will talk about some aspects of that in today's webinar and subsequent webinars as well. So, feel free to ask any questions if need be. I'm the host for this session. So if I do sort of lean forward or anything like that, it's because I'm admitting someone into the session, so please excuse me. In terms of my background, I spent over 10 years in training in procurement and consulting in procurement. I've worked in a number of different countries in Europe, UK and in Africa, South Africa and Nigeria. In industries varying from health, we've done some work with some big charities in Africa. Transport, done some work with transport companies in the UK. Education, public sector as well, so a lot of public sector authorities. I've done training with their staff and consulting around their processes as well. I'm a member of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, which is the foremost professional body for procurement, and therefore I am here to represent them in a way and make sure that I stick to best practice and what is tried and tested in the area of procurement. Okay, in terms of today's session, we will be looking at using specifications to drive cost optimization. So we're going to take it into 2 parts. So first of all, we're going to talk about specifications, and then we're going to talk about, okay, well, what is the importance of specifications in terms of cost reductions, but also in terms of helping our customers and increasing our value and increasing the potential to actually attract more customers as well. And that's another thing. In terms of procurement, what I want people to think about with procurement is not just about cost cutting, right? There's only so much cost you can cut anyway, without actually eating into your actual finished goods and services. So once you pursue the cost cutting, you should also think about, okay, adding value and attracting more customers and building up the revenue side as well. So that's what we'll look at through specifications today. Okay, so from a current standpoint, those of you who are existing clients of procurementexpress.com, the software supports the finance teams in areas such as setting approvals, allocating spend, raising purchase orders, closing purchase orders, running reports, getting good visibility across spend, and the new feature, which is request for quotations. We'll spend some time talking about that. But overall, those of you using Procurement Express, the benefit should be increased efficiency as well as reduced stress. And I've been fortunate enough to hear some feedback, and a lot of them are being very grateful to the amount of stress that Procurement Express's software has reduced. So that's where we currently are as clients of procurementexpress.com. But there is more. So what I want to talk to you about today is, with a few extra steps, with a slightly broader mindset and approach, we can start thinking about increasing profitability by reducing the cost base, as well as giving customers greater value, and potentially attracting more customers as well. So in terms of fundamentals, some of you, I'm sure, will already be familiar with these terms, but RFQ, request for quotation, is a business process that allows a company to request quotes from a supplier for the purchase of a specific product or service. So in other words, it means that you can send out a quote, you can send out a set of requirements that you need for your business to as many suppliers as you want, and based on your requirements, they will send in a quotation, their own quotations, and you can select which is the best quotation to meet your needs. Generally, it can be the lowest price. It can also be the one that gives the most benefit, which is called the most economically advantageous tender. But in any event, an RFQ allows you to attract quotations for any requirements that you have as a business. Specifications determine the ability of the supplier to quote accurately. And we'll talk about it a bit later, but it's fundamental. You can't have RFQs without good specifications, right? Specifications, and I'll go into the next slide, but specifications are the heart of the procurement, right? In terms of time, cost, risk, and reputation, right? If you get your requirements wrong, if you communicate incorrect, incomplete, ambiguous specifications to your suppliers, how do you expect them to understand what your requirement is, right? At best, they're going to be guessing. And with a guess, there's a potential that they'll be wrong. They won't only be wrong in terms of what they quote you. So, they may think you want something more with more features and therefore quote you a larger figure, a larger price. But eventually when the goods get delivered, it won't meet your internal client's needs. So that's why it's really important to get the specifications correct. And by the way, there is a knock-on effect. If suppliers deliver the wrong inputs to your business, that means you're going to be delayed in turning those inputs into either a service or a product, whatever your company produces, and you're going to actually, disappoint your own clients. So stemming from poor specifications, it can result in your own customers being upset with you and affecting your reputation, right? And that could be, that could mean your customers go elsewhere, right? What we also need to think about as well is that as companies, you are competing against your competitors' procurement processes. So if your procurement processes around specifications are better than your suppliers, customers will start coming to you, or vice versa if you're not good at your own specification. Specification is very important, and we'll talk a bit more about what it takes to draft good specifications as well. And by the way, this goes for both products and services in terms of specifications. Purpose of specification, define the, specifications define the business requirement. So they essentially put into words what a business needs. So if you need stationery, you put it into words, and that's what the supplier understands that you need. Communicating the buyer's requirements. Another thing which we're going to touch on today is that actually specifications, before they go out to the supplier, will actually work their way around internally, right? Because in order to make sure everybody who has an interest in a particular requirement has their say, you should allow everyone internally who has an interest to have input into that specification. Because what could happen, for example, if one department writes the specification on their own, ignoring the interest of another department, when the specification goes out, you'll find that that department that hasn't had their input, you know, whatever comes back won't meet their requirement. So it's very important that specifications, when drafted, are drafted internally first with all the different stakeholders internally before they go out to the supplier. Also in purchase orders. So if you think about a purchase order, the actual meat of a purchase order, apart from the price, is the requirement. You know, what's expected from the supplier and what obligations do they have to meet in terms of the requirement. So specification plays a key part in the purchase order, as well as KPIs. So the question is, how do you judge the performance of a service or a product if you haven't got specifications to benchmark it against? So it's the specifications that you will use to benchmark whether or not a product or service you've received from a supplier is satisfactory or not. And that's why specifications are also important as well. The last point is about supporting standardization, and we'll touch on that shortly. Okay, in terms of the context for this webinar, I'm going to focus on indirect procurement, right? And the reason for that is, by the way, indirect procurements, I mean procurements which support the business activity and don't necessarily go into the finished product. So for example, if you're a furniture company, wood, material, you know, fabric, that would be a direct procurement because that goes in directly into making furniture. But stationery, paper, all things that make the office run are indirect procurements. So I want to focus on indirect procurements because generally they're more sort of less complex. And as most of us on this call are finance, you know, work in a finance role, it's a lot easier to understand indirect procurement such as stationery, paper, furniture, computer hardware, rather than direct procurements, which potentially could be complex depending on the nature of what your business does. Those of you that are in finance and you know, using procurementexpresses.com software are likely not to be the budget holder, right? And in that case, that tends to mean that there's a hands-off approach. So the budget holder is left to get on with spending the money, and finance, you know, just processes those payments. What I want to do is change that approach to have a more shared ownership approach. So rather than just, as I said, allowing the budget holder to get on and spend, finance can also adopt some procurement best practices and start not necessarily challenging the budget holder, but providing the budget holder with additional information that will allow them to make the best decision around what they intend to spend their budget on. And therefore, in finance, well, those of you who are in finance using procurementexpress.com software, I want to introduce another concept, which is called that of an internal consultant. An internal consultant is essentially asking you to not only understand the budget holder's requirements and what they need to help them do their jobs, but also it involves you speaking to suppliers and understanding the supply base. So if you take some of the indirect procurements I've given example for, stationery, paper, furniture, computer hardware, you know, what stops us in finance from getting to know more about who the stationery providers are in your area, right? What stops us from knowing who the paper suppliers are, furniture suppliers are, and computer hardware? And by getting to know them, I mean talking to them, right? Asking questions about what offerings they have. Maybe reading up on their websites and looking at what their price points are, what variations of stationery they offer, and so on. Once you improve your knowledge on the suppliers and the supply base and what the offerings are, then you have a lot more information to share with the budget holder, right? Because when you have a conversation with the budget holder may say, look, I want, you know, these type of pens. But because you've had conversations with suppliers of stationery around pens, you're able to say to that budget holder, well, hang on, yes, you want this pen, and ultimately... Yeah,
that's a really good point. I mean, what does it... I can often see a situation where, let's say you have quite highly skilled people on the ground who they think, well, they do know who the quote unquote best supplier is, maybe in terms of quality, you know. How do you avoid kind of, you know, looking too smart, if you like, you know, saying, you know, like, well, I found this other guy, you're buying from I don't know, a very posh store. I don't know what the posh store is in the UK, but let's say you're buying from the high street retailer, but I found this backstreet guy way cheaper. You know, because you could get into a kind of conflict situation there.
Very much so. Very good, very good question. And that's why, you know, I've tagged on the word consultants there as well. you know, it's all well and good talking about what we're talking about, but actually, and we'll talk about it in subsequent webinars, communication and your ability to understand stakeholders' interests. So James, you're talking about, you know, how do you speak to someone? First of all, you have to understand what their interests are, right? And try and not only understand their interests, but get to speak their language and ask questions in such a way that's less threatening. Now, that in itself is a skill, right? That, you know, it's not handed to you. You have to work on how you approach those budget holders and the nature of the conversations. And that is another reason why I've said to you in the past, it's not just finance people we want in this kind of webinar. We want those budget holders to be in this webinar as well. Because if they can start understanding why questions are being asked of them and what the context for those questions are, there's a chance they'll be less defensive when they get asked questions, because they'll understand that actually, you know, this chapter's asking me the questions, asking for the best interests of myself, right? Not asking to challenge how much budget I'm spending or anything like that. It's just throwing some new options there that I may not be aware of. So if possible, you know, the tendencies for people to think, right, it's a procurement webinar, therefore just have procurement. But actually, procurement's tentacles reach across all different parts of the business. And therefore, it's important to try and pull those people into these sessions so they understand a bit of background to what procurement's about. And it's not just about cost cutting. It's about helping them make a better decision. And that's the role of internal consultants. But before you can even get to that stage of asking questions or you know, being diplomatic and finding the best communication, you need to be knowledgeable, right? You need to know what you're talking about around the supply. And that's why I've said that, you know, we should focus for now on indirect procurements, because generally they're things that, you know, they're not too complex and we can get our heads around them. And in terms of getting knowledge, speak to suppliers. Suppliers would love to speak to you. They're more than happy to answer your questions. Don't just speak to one supplier because they may lead you down the garden path, but speak to a number of suppliers and get an idea, get a feel for what's out there, become knowledgeable. And that's how you can develop the cost optimization that we're talking about. That's a key strand of it. How developing a specification can achieve cost optimization. So I'm going to go into all these points now. So I'll just run through these. Spend category, business needs, standardization, reducing variety, which I talked about earlier, aggregating demand, so bringing demand together and appealing to a wider supply market. So I'll go into all of these one by one. So the first thing to think about is, you know, a lot of companies have a lot of indirect spend categories, right? Some companies, larger companies, can run into tens of thousands of different indirect categories, right? I guess the benefit of using procurementexpress.com is you can see that spend in real time across all the different categories. Based on what I've just said about the work that it takes to understand the supply market, we need to prioritize which categories we're going to spend time to try and understand and make better decisions on. And the best way to prioritize is a principle called, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, the Pareto 80-20, 20-80, which essentially says, you know, if you have 100 different categories of indirect spend, 20% of those categories will represent 80% of your total spend. So out of the 100 categories, we really want to focus on those 20 supply or those 20 categories, because potentially they represent 80% of our total spend, right? And that's how we can prioritize. So we can focus on those 20 categories because we know if we can get some cost optimization going on there, it's going to have a bigger impact on our bottom line, right? As I said, it takes work to do this, you know, to research and to understand supply markets and resource. So let's focus and prioritize on where it's going to have the biggest impact. So there is a need to look across your spend category. Where are you spending the most money, and target those ones first. Business needs. So I think this touches a bit on James's question. So a business needs is essentially saying, when a budget holder requests something, do they actually need it or do they want it? Yeah, do they need it or do they want it? And the way to sort of, you know, differentiate between the two is finding out whether whatever the budget holder requires actually supports the business's activity. So there should be a direct link between what's requested and what it does for the business. Either it goes in, you know, either it's a direct input, so it goes into the finished product or service, or it's fundamental to supporting the office or, you know, the operational side that supports your overall service. So it's an either indirect or direct procurement. If it's not, then that's when it becomes a one. And that's when we need to be able to think, well, hang on, actually, maybe we don't need to have this spend. And you'll be surprised it happens a lot, especially when you allow, and we'll talk about maverick buying later, but especially when budget holders are allowed to sort of, buy based on whatever their budget is. In addition to that, we're also looking at things like, so there's a phrase called challenging the user. I don't like the word challenge because challenge implies adversarial, and it implies that you're sort of, it's you v them. I prefer to use the word collaborate, so collaboration with the user. And it's really about doing things like clarifying the requirement. So you can, for example, if you say to someone, you need a television, right? You need a TV, right? You and I know that there are TVs with so many features on them, right? The question is, why do we need the TV, right? We need the TV to watch BBC, to watch different channels. I'm not sure where everybody is at the moment, but I think everyone's heard of BBC. So, we need it to watch news channels, for example. In that case, do you need the TV to be, full HD, 4Q, 5Q, and all these different fancy features that you hear about with TVs, right? The answer is no. Actually, all you need to do is be able to watch a TV. So you can have a scenario where someone wants a TV and yet you go and buy a top of the range television, right, with all the features. And actually, when you get to use a TV, you don't use most of those features. So therefore, it's a waste of money. And that's called over specification. So when we talk about challenging the user, part of it is to actually match the requirement with the specification to make sure that there's no additional features that are not going to be used or not needed that you're actually going to end up paying for. Because if you buy a brand new top of the range TV, you're paying for all the features, but you're not using them. So that's essentially a waste. So what we're trying to do is reduce over specification by clarifying and asking questions of the user about what they want it for. Okay, the next area is that of standardization and variety reduction. I previously did a job with a company in the transport sector, and one of the things we found was they had 17 different glove specifications, right? So they had 17 different glove specifications from 17 different suppliers, and essentially had, quite minimal spend with each of those 17 different suppliers, right? And what was the cause of that? How come they had 17 different glove specifications? And that was down to what is referred to as maverick buying or budget holder preferences. Maverick buying is essentially where a budget holder, doesn't have any reins or constraint about what they buy. It's more impulse buying. I like the look of that, we'll buy it. I like the look of that, we'll buy it. And that's what happens. So you have all the different budget holders within this very large transport organization, by the way, but you have a lot of different departments with buyers doing what they want. So, buyer A will buy their particular brand of gloves, buyer B will buy their favorite gloves, buyer C will buy their favorite gloves. And that's how you end up with 17 different specifications. The problem with that, and what we found, is that when one of those budget holders leaves the company, you find that no one else uses the gloves because they all have their own gloves that they like using. So what happens is when you go into the inventory, you find a big big volume of gloves that for the last 6 months haven't been used. And when you ask why, it's like, oh, well, the budget holder who ordered them, he's left or she's left, and no one else likes them, so no one uses them. And that's essentially, as you all know, cash sitting in your inventory and no one's using them. Bear in mind as well that gloves can go past their use-by date, right? They can become obsolete. So essentially that's money just down the drain because of this maverick buying, and there's no coordination around who's buying what. And that's what we found. So in terms of the solution, what we said to ourselves was, look, gloves are a very homogeneous product, right? At the end of the day, what are gloves supposed to do, right? Gloves are supposed to protect our hands for safety. Obviously in the transport sector, protecting your hands is very important. Keep your hands warm, especially if you're involved in security or whatever. So, there are probably a couple of other reasons, but my point is, whoever within that organization, the budget holders, they all needed the glove for the same reason, which was to protect your hands and keep your hands warm. So why have 17 different specifications, right? That's when we then decided, okay, well, look, let's speak to suppliers. And going back to what I said about being an internal consultant, speak to suppliers, understand what the standard type glove is that, fits all purposes, right? Protects your hands, keeps you warm, good quality, etc. And come up with one specification. So essentially what we did is we said, okay, because gloves are homogenous and we all need, all the 17 different budget holders need them for the same reason, let's streamline it into one specification.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but it struck me that there could be value actually in working with an external consultant maybe as well. So you don't need to be like, great, it's great to do it internally, fine, but actually someone like yourself can come in and say, well, we paid this external guy and he found that we were buying all these gloves.
Yeah.
Not my fault. He said it, but what he's saying makes sense. Like in a way, what you're saying is a lot of common sense, right?
Yeah.
But it's the political way of bringing it up. So actually working with someone externally might help
drive that change. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And like you said, sometimes it takes someone from outside to actually see that. Some organizations are quite set in their culture and traditions, and the way it's always been is the way that it will continue to go. So it does take that sometimes that external input and drive to make that change. But ultimately, yeah, so it doesn't just happen, right? So it's one thing to say, right, we can standardize the gloves. You need to actually consult. So speak to those budget holders and say, look, what is your requirement, right? Speak to the suppliers and find what is a one-size-fits-all type glove that can meet all those needs, right? And then come out with that specification. And essentially what you're doing is, and essentially what we did was to say, across, let's just give you an example. I can't remember what the numbers were, but if across the 17 different suppliers, they were buying 10 units of each. So from 17 suppliers, they were buying 10 units from each supplier. That's 170 gloves in total. When you bring that into one specification, rather than ordering 10 gloves from 17 different suppliers, what you're now doing is ordering 170 gloves from one supplier. And that's where you get all the benefits. That's where you aggregate the demand, you aggregate the volumes, right, with one supplier. And immediately what that does, well, there are a number of things. So in terms of benefits, the first thing is from an internal procurement point of view, you're not dealing with 17 purchase orders, you're dealing with one. You're dealing with one set of specifications. So in terms of internal process costs, they're greatly reduced, right? What you also have is, because you've come up with a one-size-fits-all glove, but because you've come up with a glove that is quite standard across all the suppliers, what you have is a situation where the one specification glove you have, all the suppliers supply in the market. So when you have a lot of suppliers that are able and attracted to supply, that increases competition. And by increasing competition, you get better prices and better value. Yeah. So because you've consulted with the supply market and all the suppliers in the market produce those gloves, when you go out to tender or send out your RFQs, you're going to get a lot of interest because they all make those gloves or that one specification glove. And therefore, you're going to get competition. And that competition, better prices, better treatment, etc. Yeah. Also, you're not dependent on one supplier. A big thing with procurement is supplier failure. What happens if our supplier goes out of business? Well, if there are many suppliers who supply this standard glove, you're never going to have that problem. You've always got another supplier who's ready and able to supply. In addition, like I said, if you're ordering 170 gloves from one supplier, you have leverage. All of a sudden, you're a big customer now. Whereas before, that supplier only saw you buying 10 units at a time. Now you're buying 170 units at a time. Suppliers are businesses as well, and they recognize who are big clients, right? And then you start getting things like first in line treatment. So take, for example, right now with the pandemic, there's so much shortages going on in various different categories. If you are a supplier and you have 10 different customers to supply, but you can only supply 3 of them, you're going to supply your biggest customers first, right? And you're going to say sorry to your smaller customers because they don't matter as much, right? So you get what I call first in line treatment with suppliers. Sorry, James, yeah.
Yeah, we've seen customers do this, and what they sometimes do is they'll go and negotiate a rebate in advance, right? Yeah. So they'll say, go to one supplier, say, listen, you're the best. We like you. We have a lot of other business. If I could 10x my business with you next year, will you give me a 20% discount? Yeah. And then you're locked in to say, you don't have to go to the effort of doing it unless they say yes. And then you know what you get, and exactly. They'll love you.
Yeah, precisely. That's exactly it. And apart from the price, there's also the value added. So things like I said, if your supplier has short supply, they will supply you first. So then you never run the risk of running out of supply, right? In terms of, your delivery dates, they're always going to want to be on time because they don't want to lose business, because they know it, there are many other suppliers who supply those gloves and they don't want to lose you. So there are a lot of additional value added benefits apart from just price reduction that you can get from your supplier. Your suppliers get better at supplying you, so they make less defect. The learning curve over time, they'll get better. And the final point as well is a very topical point, which is to say, whereas before you had 17 different deliveries of gloves, now you've just got that one delivery for 170 gloves. So in terms of your carbon footprint, that's been reduced. Now, if any of your organizations have, and increasingly a lot of businesses have environmental targets, procurement can contribute towards environmental targets by doing such things, by turning 17 deliveries into one. We can do another session on how you can actually track that and how you can measure that. But that becomes marketing. And that's what I was saying earlier about, it's not just about price reduction, because ultimately you can say to your marketing team, we're reducing our carbon footprint, advertise that to our clients. So your potential clients will say, oh, we'll choose these guys because actually they've got a, they're looking out for the environment, they've reduced their carbon footprint, as opposed to your competitors who are not even thinking about that. So that's what I mean by, apart from just reducing costs, which we've talked about, procurement and through standardization can also help marketing, right? And that can also drive more customers, because a lot of customers, especially the big, I think I mentioned this before, Unilever have said they will award contracts to suppliers on a scoring system, and 10% of that scoring system is about what the supplier is doing with the environment. So if you can say to Unilever, look, use us, we reduce our carbon emissions from turning 17 into 1, and we can track that, that's going to put your score up in terms of your ability to win a contract. So that's directly boosting your revenue. And that's what I want people, to think about from procurement. It's not just about cost cutting. It's also about driving revenue and increasing your customers, increasing your marketing. That could open new markets for you as well. So yeah. So statistics wise, potential lead time reduction. So when we talk about lead times, you've got internal lead times. So internal lead times are how long it takes to get a purchase order out the door, as it were, in terms of specifications, purchase order approval, and so on. External lead times are how long it takes for the supplier, once they've received the purchase order, to deliver. So a combination of the two is lead time. So because you're using a supplier that knows exactly what you want and doesn't have to second guess your requirements, because they've been using you for, or you've been using them for a while, it reduces the lead time. What I said earlier about the internal procurement process is reduced because you're only dealing with one purchase order. That's where you get the reduction in lead time. Same with life cycle savings as well. You're not writing many different specifications as well. So those are the benefits there. In terms of establishing needs, it just touches on the question you asked, James, earlier about, how do you ask questions of the budget holder? I mean, you want to start asking questions that start with these phrases or these words, because that will elicit, these are open-ended questions that will give you information. And they're very important. So things like, who's it for? What is it for? Where is it needed? Big area in procurement is about, where it's to be, the goods are to be delivered to. That's not considered. So that needs to be considered as well. When is it needed? Again, if you can, if it's not necessary, potentially you can order from suppliers during their low season of business and therefore get better benefits that way. So when the procurement's needed is very important. Why it's needed, again, is it a business need? Is it a business want? And how, how is it going to be used within the business and so on? So all these suggestions of questions can help you understand what we talked about earlier about whether it's a business need, whether it's not, and also that part about clarification to make sure that you're not over specifying as well. This is what we touched on earlier, James, around communication. So, take all opportunities to discuss and check understanding of outcomes with colleagues and suppliers. So what we're saying there is, humble yourself and, take a sort of, what's the word, a learning approach. So you speak to suppliers and you learn from them. You don't need, suppliers are experts in that area that they're supplying. So you can learn from them if you listen to them. Same with your colleagues. I think one other thing I'd say, James, to add to what you said earlier, and we'll talk about it in other sessions, is listening. There's not enough listening that goes on in conversations, shall I say, or in relationships. And I think, and there's different types of listening, which again, we can talk about, but good, effective listening can make a big difference in how your relationships with your colleagues, your budget holders, and your suppliers develop. Communication as well. Again, we can do something on communication in terms of language in terms of understanding the interests of stakeholders and things like that. But that's very important. If this is going to work at your role as an internal consultant, you need to be able to communicate. There's no two ways about that. So sorry, and that's touched on another point, which is a big area of procurement now is about soft skills. So it's about your communication, your resilience, your team building, and things like that. Again, these are topics we can talk about. In terms of drafting specifications, as I said earlier, they have to be clear and unambiguous, comprehensive, and comprehensive means no gaps, right? And to have no gaps, you must make sure that everyone who's concerned in your business about a particular requirement is consulted. Otherwise, when you get the requirements in, you're going to have problems, and they're not going to be happy. Concise, right? But you do not need to, if you don't need to say something, don't say it. Keep it concise, keep it short. Don't forget as well that, you want to try and make it easy for suppliers to read your specifications. If you give them reams and reams of specifications, they're going to lose interest. So try and make it concise as well. Standards are very important. International standards, national standards. You just need to be aware of what relevant standards apply to the product, and also keep them up to date. New regulations come in and so on. You need to keep them up to date. Last part is around specifications. And again, there's a lot more detail behind this, but just very sort of high level. There are two types of specifications. There's when you're writing specifications, there are conformance specifications and performance specifications. Conformance specifications talk about what the requirement, product or service must consist of, whereas performance specification talk about what it should do. So since there are car images in the background, let's take a car, right? If you were writing a conformance specification for a car, you would be saying what the car should consist of. So you'd be talking about what the engine capacity should be, right? What the size of the tire should be, whether it should be a manual or an automatic, how many seats it should have, whether it should be you're very specific about what the car should contain, right? And that's a conformance specification. Whereas if you're using a performance specification, you're talking about what the car should do. So rather than talking about the engine size, you're talking about what average speed the car should have, what fuel consumption it should have, what it's likely to carry. So if you're carrying goods, say that the purpose of this vehicle is to carry goods. So that's you're saying what it should do rather than what it should consist of, and there is a big difference in that. So conformance specification examples are things like technical drawings, right? If you work in engineering and design and so on, by definition, you'll be writing conformance specifications. If an architect gives you a plan, they are saying this house or building must consist of these measurements, right? There's no other way to do it. It must consist of these measurements. They may even go as far as saying what materials the house should be, house should consist of. So that's what makes it a conformance specification. Brands are also a conformance specification. If you say you want an Apple laptop, right? It must, the laptop from the supplier's point of view must consist of being an Apple. And we'll talk about what the difference is when we go through the performance side. Recipes, chemical formulas. I don't know if anyone cooks out here, but if you follow recipes, that is a conformance specification, right? Because it's very specific about what ingredients and the quantities. Samples, they're also specification. If you give if you give the supplier a sample, they have to copy it, right? So what they produce must consist of the sample you've given them. Recognized standards as well. So ISO standards in the UK, British Standards Institute, and obviously in other countries, they have their own national standards as well. That is a conformance specification. So you're saying the requirement must consist of this standard. On the other hand, like I said, you have performance specifications, and they focus more about the output, what the service or the product should do, right? So how fast the car should go, what it should carry, what fuel consumption should be, etc. Also things like, what is the operating environment? Is it going to be off-road? Is it going to be in a mountainous area? All that kind of information can guide the supplier on what's the best solution based on what output you want. How the product will interface with other elements, or if it's going to be linked to anything else, required safety levels, and the environmental performance. So whether it's an electric car or whatever. Now, just going back to what I said about the Apple laptop, let's use that as an example. If someone said, they want an Apple laptop, that is a conformance specification. Now, the question is, do they really need an Apple laptop, right? And based on what I said earlier, in terms of over specification, if someone says they want an Apple laptop, and then you ask them, well, what do you need the Apple laptop for? And they say, well, actually, I need it to use PowerPoint, I need to use Excel, I need to use Word. Then really, they don't actually need an Apple laptop, right? They can have any laptop that will do the job for them, yeah? And that's why using a performance specification is better, because if you use a performance specification, you'll just say, look, I want a laptop that has Word, has PowerPoint, has Excel, right? And what you do then is you open up the supply market. Remember, in procurement, we're interested in opening up as many suppliers as possible to supply us. And if you say you want a laptop that, you know, does Excel and so on, that means it could be an Acer laptop, it could be a Dell laptop, it could be an HP laptop, it could be any laptop that would meet that requirement. It would be able to do all those, you know, Word document things. Whereas by focusing on an Apple laptop, you essentially cut yourself off from all the suppliers who don't supply Apple, but supply equally good laptops that could still meet your requirement. I remember what I said earlier, when you reduce the amount of suppliers you have, there's less competition and you're potentially paying a higher price. When you have many suppliers, then that drops the price because of the competition. So using performance specification, when you say what the laptop should do, you're not restricting the supplier to any brand, and therefore you're likely to get more suppliers in. And that's one of the benefits of using performance specifications ahead of conformance specifications. The benefits, as you know, I've mentioned the point about, you know, wider supply base at the bottom, but also it's easier to draft. It's easier to say what you want the car to do than to actually be very particular about the engine size, the tire size, etc. One other thing to bear in mind, when you use a conformance specification, so for example, if I asked a car supplier to supply me with a particular engine size, a particular tire size, a particular number of seats, and they supplied what I asked for, and then I gave it to the budget holder, and they said, well, this is no use to me, it doesn't do what I want it to do, whose fault is that? It's not the supplier's fault, because they've done everything you've asked. They've given you the engine size, they've given you the tire size, they've given you the number of seats. The fact that the budget holder now says it's no use to them, that's not the supplier's fault, it's your fault. And that's the risk you run with using a conformance specification. You potentially, if you don't get the conformance specification right, it's your fault. Whereas if you use a performance specification and you say, look, I want the car to carry vegetables and fruits, I want it to have a cooling system, etc. If the supplier provides a vehicle that doesn't have a cooling system or doesn't keep fresh food, then it's a supplier's fault because you've asked it to do that and it can't do that. So it's a lot easier from a risk point of view to use performance specification than it is to use conformance. And that is it. Yeah, look, we've gone over sort of high level over quite a number of things, but sort of takeaway points are things around standardization. I think a key point that James talks about was communication, very important. You know, I often say one of the things we don't teach is politics. So I've done work in places like, you know, Nigeria and South Africa, and you know, you start getting into interest. Interest play a big part in certain procurements and why things are happening, why people are going for more expensive products when they're cheaper products and things like that. It's very difficult to advise people in their own different organizations, but it is about trying to figure out what is the interest of the other party and figuring out the best way to communicate with them. I have some, you know, crazy stories about corruption and things like that that go on in procurement and how people are threatened with losing their jobs if they introduce a cheaper product. And I did have someone ask me, look, Kala, what do I do? You know, I've seen, so there was a situation where someone had to, there was a building project that was in a rural area in Nigeria that had to be done. And this chap was the monitoring officer. So he would go out to site to check how much work had been done against what's been, you know, what funds have been released. So I think 50% of the funds had been released. And yet when he got to the site, there was nothing there. And he turned around and said, he went back to his boss to say, look, 50% has been released, but no work is being done. The contractor, there's no machinery in there, nothing. And the boss said, look, the next time you go there, you'll lose your job. So he said to me, look, Kala, what do I do in that situation? You know, there's obviously, as a government, we're obviously losing a lot of money because this project's not being executed. But I'm being threatened with losing my job. And in the public sector, you wouldn't lose your job. You could just get transferred to the other side of the country. He's got a family. And then, you know, he's asking me, what do I do? And I'm like, I can't tell you to lose your job, but all I can say, you know, from my point of view, what I can do is say, this is, you know, what is best practice? You know, I'm in the business of talking about best practice. Sometimes you have to figure out, you know, what you need to do in your own office environment in terms of interest, communication. You know, one of the things you could have done is speak to a supplier and say, look, I know my boss has said this, but look, still get to site. And there are other ways around it, but yeah, individual circumstances require individual methods, I'd say. Yeah. That's it. Thank you very much. So, sorry, if you do want to contact me, here's my email address. In terms of processes and how you actually implement some of the stuff I've talked about, I'll be more than happy to support on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Kala. Really good stuff. I mean, your point there is very relevant. A lot of this is, you know, some of it is common sense in plain sight, some of it is a little bit more nuanced. Yeah. Then when it actually comes down to doing it and you realize, oh, now I have to call a supplier, and now what do I say? What are the words I use and everything? I think that's why people could really benefit if they need to. If you're a customer at Procurement Express, they have access to you. You know, there's maybe if they want to have a one-on-one to figure out an actual plan to affect this, and like that, maybe figure out the plan for the individual internal discussions that need to have. It strikes me as well that this sort of content is good for, you know, for the finance teams, but it's very good content for the people on the operations side too as well, so they understand the context, so it's not coming out of the blue. So and I know Procurement Express will be releasing as part of this a training which is going to be available for any ops or finance people to go through these fundamentals, which everyone should be aware of, and that's also going to be available to our customers in the coming weeks. So thank you very much for coming along, Kala. Really appreciate your expertise and your enthusiasm.
Thank you.
We're going to send you the recording. Thanks, Rob, for reminding me. We're going to send out the recording, and even if you're listening to this after the fact, please reach out to Kala or myself. And thanks for coming along.